All right, well, we'll make a start. It wouldn't be a military talk if we didn't start on time. I don't get a moderator for this talk, so I introduce myself. Michael Reade's my name. I'm an officer in the Australian Defence Force and have been for the last 33 years. I was initially asked by Jean-Louis to speak on this subject last year, and no doubt it was in his mind at that stage that right now we're standing just about exactly 2,000 kilometres by road from Kiev, and the sort of topics that we're going to discuss in the next 25 minutes or so, which were once theoretical, historical, are now things that are occupying military medical colleagues day to day. And often those colleagues are quite junior. They're what we would call in Australia pre-vocational doctors, quite soon out of medical school. They're in an environment where they're professionally quite isolated, and they're enormously challenging problems that really historically no military medical force has found a very good solution for. So that's why I think this talk is topical. My purpose in the next 25 minutes or so is to outline some of that complexity for you and perhaps to give you some sympathy for those doctors on both sides of that conflict, but perhaps also on all conflicts, and potentially also to help some of you give some thought to how we might improve this situation, provide guidance for those doctors, and make things better ultimately. I'm going to try and give you a balanced view, essentially, of why the military has come to view, or at least most military forces around the world have come to view doctors as non-combatants, as it is the case for nurses and chaplains and other people who work within the healthcare system. And when I say a balanced view, what I mean by that is that although you might ask the person in the street, why should that be the case? And they would say, well, that is, of course, the right thing to do. And that is true, but that's half the explanation, you might say. I would say the other half of the explanation is that it is in the interests of the nation state fielding that medical force for those people to be non-combatants rather than to be part of the military force that is prosecuting the conflict. And I'm going to give, at the end of the talk, I'm going to give you 4 reasons why it's in the interests of the military force to have doctors as non-combatants rather than as part of the combatant force. So that's what we're going to lead up to. We're going to get there through a series of examples and a discussion of the history of how we got there. I'm very much speaking off my own bat, if you like. This isn't formal Australian government policy, and I'm going to show you some images, but they've all been shown in the public domain before. I can't give this talk without making some fundamental assumptions, and I respect the fact that many people in the world don't agree with these assumptions. But you're going to have to bear with me. It's not possible to talk about armed forces and military support for those armed forces without at least making the assumption that that is a legitimate activity. So bear with me, and if we're going to have an argument about this at the end, I just pose that that's probably not going to be a productive argument. So the first place to start, or the place to start, is to distinguish military medical support from humanitarian operations. And I will confess that in the eyes of, and in the speech and the publications of many military forces, probably over the last 20 to 30 years, this line has become blurred, although we're now making very active efforts to de-blur that line. The United Nations and others have defined what are called the 4 humanitarian principles: humanity, impartiality, neutrality and independence. And the humanitarian organisations, some of which have their logos displayed there, have at their core those principles. The military cannot be party to all of those 4. That's just a fundamental characteristic of being a military force that's aligned to a government that seeks to prosecute its own agenda. I think we can behave for the benefit of humanity. Certainly I've tried to do that, and every force that I've been a part of in a deployed environment over 30 years has tried to do that. I've tried, and those forces have tried to deliver healthcare in an impartial way, as are required by the Geneva Conventions, which we'll talk about. But it's not possible to be neutral. I was always acting on behalf of the Australian government, and therefore it's also not possible to be independent. So military medical forces cannot be humanitarian forces. They have to be distinct. And we've learnt, I'm going to say of late, to recognise that distinction. I have enormous respect for the people who go out to the field and apply those humanitarian principles. In fact, many people work for both organisations. I've deployed to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to Bosnia, with people who also have worked for the ICRC and MSF, and they see no conflict in doing both of those jobs for those two organisations, but at separate times, and that's fine, but an important distinction. The next thing to talk about is the rules-based approach to war. We're going to talk a lot about international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, and the laws that govern non-combatant status of doctors in times of war. But all of that presupposes that we should have laws at all, or rules in times of war. And back in the 1800s and earlier, when we went to war dressed up in a fancy uniform, and gentlemen fought in a gentlemanly way, and it was gentlemen back then, you could sort of see why it was proper and right to have a chivalrous code that treated one another in a particular way, and you wouldn't want anyone to breach that code. But then in modern warfare, where destruction is on an enormous scale and translates not just into the battlefield but into the civilian population, it's potentially reasonable to postulate that to defend one's population by any means, to have no rules, to stop this sort of thing happening, is a reasonable thing to do. Again, most of us reject that idea, but I can see the validity, or at least I could expect I would see the validity if I was walking through the streets of Dresden in 1944. But I'll ask you now some questions, and maybe you think maybe war should have rules as it pertains to military medical involvement. Should we, treat enemy casualties before our own soldiers if they're more severely wounded? We're supposed to value all human life. Should we be part of the enhanced questioning, in inverted commas, or the torture of prisoners, even if it's just to make sure that that keeps those prisoners alive? By extension, perhaps should we engage in the force feeding of prisoners if those prisoners decide of their own free will to engage in hunger strikes? Should we ration medical resources to preserve fighting capability, as was done during the Second World War, when penicillin was in very short supply, for example? The history is very clear. Allied forces rationed penicillin for people with venereal disease so that they could be returned to the front, but denied it to people with severe combat wounds because they were much less likely to go back to the fight. Was that an ethical thing to do? Is it acceptable to make access to medical resources dependent on military objectives? So should we turn up to a village in another country, an economically deprived country, and say, well, you can come to our clinic, but only if you allow us to establish a forward operating base in the village? Is that an ethical thing to do? I'll show you examples of where people have stood their ground and said, no, it's not. Should we use medical expertise to develop weaponry or defence against weaponry? If we're presented with soldiers in our clinic, and the soldiers have some sort of mental or physical condition, should we certify them fit to fight, even though we recognise that that increases their chance of death on the battlefield? if we're compelled by a medical authority to break patient confidentiality, should we do that? If we're in an environment, as I'll describe to you in some detail, where we become aware of the mistreatment of patients, should we report that? Or do we owe a duty to our military colleagues to not do that? Should we prescribe performance-enhancing drugs like amphetamines to pilots or steroids to soldiers who have to carry heavy loads, even if that's at the expense of their health? And so on and so on. And all the way down to the bottom there, should we engage in combat? Should we be combatants? And the bottom line is, should we act primarily as military officers or as doctors? We have this dual loyalty. Now we're in uniform, we're military officers, but we're also part of this professional group that has its own ethics and what happens when those two things come into conflict. And this has been addressed in many, many academic papers, and this is, I think, a particularly pertinent one because it's published by the US military. It's in the US textbook of military medicine. And these authors, writing in their textbook, say that it's fundamentally incompatible to be both a military physician and a US military officer. So that's a point of view. I don't actually share it, and I'll explain why I don't over the next few slides. But let's just step back and go through history. How did we end up where we are? So, before sort of 1600s, really there wasn't much attention paid to the health of soldiers. But with the restoration of the monarchy, at least in the British Army in 1660, the first physicians were appointed to the army. Their purpose was to just maintain the health of the soldiers so they could maintain their fighting capability. And that remained the case throughout the Napoleonic Wars, where there were considerable advances in military medicine. In particular, many of you will have read about the introduction of the ambulance services, the triage that came with the French Surgeon Larrey. But still fundamentally, the military medical focus was on returning soldiers to combat rather than anything to do with their personal health. The expansion of that focus saw the British Medical Staff Corps introduced in 1855 and the Royal Army Medical Corps just before the turn of the century. But really they were inadequate for the soldiers who had been so severely injured they couldn't be returned to the fight. And so in addition to the official military medical service, there were these voluntary organisations, such as the hospital that Florence Nightingale worked in during the Crimean War and the Red Cross volunteer hospitals during the Second World War, that worked with the military authorities but were not under their control. They were voluntary hospitals. But that didn't really work in the Second World War, because in the Second World War we moved from a static sort of battlefield, which had been needed to be able to tell their medical assets where to go, and we couldn't rely on those volunteer assets, and that's by those sorts of hospitals. It looked after prisoners of war, for example, and not the soldiers directly. Towards the end of the 20th assistance domain, so here's ADF operations in Indonesia and Pakistan, and it was recognised that this really wasn't a very functional relationship with the non-government organisations, the humanitarian organisations that were, in a sense, competing in that space. A civilian agency cannot fill the gap. Can a military medical force provide that sort of assistance? And the history operations, and after then, you won't be able to read the fine print there, but in green, they've all been civilian-led operations, admittedly with some military logistics. Combatant doctor. So we all think of Hippocrates as the father of medicine. What did Hippocrates think about this? Well, when Xerxes was said to have requested the help of Hippocrates to assist his soldiers from the battlefield, he said to have refused. So this idea that we help everyone is not necessarily a time-honoured concept. And this was true too in the Crusades. The Knights Hospitalier in the Middle East were there to fight the battle as much as they who has a very large American training base named after him that trains American servicemen, won the Medal of Honour. Although a physician, when all of the officers of his regiment were killed, he took command of with the British Army in India, initially defending his patients, which is considered an acceptable task for a medical officer, but then the idea of just defending his patients. So all of this changed in 1859 after the Battle of Solferino. French and Austrian physicians there were just simply not coping, and what's more, needed some sort of organisation to enable them to deliver appropriate care to those casualties. And what's more, there were a whole lot of civilians in the area who were able to deliver that care. So he was able to facilitate that, and in having done so, reflected in this book, a very famous book, that an organisation that had as its purpose solely the delivery which subsequently led to the Geneva Conventions and the concept of a non-combatant physician and nurse and combatants mustn't take part in hostile action. They must treat people on the basis of need rather than on the affiliation of the patient. And to designate non-combatants, we wear one of the symbols that you can see there, one of the three symbols. And to hold oneself out as a non-combatant, but then to take advantage of that and to take part in the conflict to gain military advantage is defined as perfidy, which is essentially a war crime. It's a kind of interesting little quirk of the Geneva Conventions that you're not supposed to have a veterinary facility as part of a hospital, or at least as a permanent part of a hospital. So although we do actually treat military distance from our hospital in Kandahar for that reason. Animals are considered tools of war rather than patients protected by international. Any ethical responsibility that one might have as a military officer. And it talks about confidentiality of information, although all of this remains subject to national law. So if your national law says that you must breach confidentiality, that essentially contradicts itself. This is a very controversial, what's called additional protocol that was introduced in 1977 that says all patients are eligible for care in a deployed military medical facility, whether or not they've been part of the approaches to development health more broadly, in that you don't want to you're only expecting to spend a few months or a few years. That would be the wrong thing to do in terms of developmental economics and health development. But this says, no, that's not true. If you've come with a hospital with a full surgical facility and a CT scanner and an MRI and what have you, then every patient in that country should be eligible to have that, even if that means that facility is going to be overwhelmed. I say this is a little controversial because not every nation has signed up to this. Really comes back to that principle that we mentioned at the start. The role of the medical corps is to return the soldiers to battle. With that patient, and to act as their advocate and to exercise their best judgment in doing so, and to question everything, not to act as and that means that things can sometimes go wrong. So here's an example of when things went desperately wrong. In 2003, an Iraqi man, Baha Musa, was arrested by British forces, and in the custody of the 1st Battalion of the Queensland, he was tortured, as the inquiry subsequently found, and ultimately that led to his death some 36 hours after he was taken into custody. That is an inexcusable event. Where this becomes a little controversial is in the involvement of the medical officer, who'd only been part of that unit for some days. He was called to resuscitate the patient, which he did to the best of his ability, and he was not found at any fault in his technical application of skills in trying to resuscitate Baha Musa. But where he was found at fault was that he didn't report all of the injuries that he found on the patient, or he was found to have, that he should have seen on the patient as he conducted that resuscitation. And that in a subsequent inquiry, he was dishonest in not reporting those injuries. And the United Kingdom Medical Practitioners Tribunal Service, essentially the GMC, then cancelled his registration. He's no longer a doctor because of that. And I've given you the extracts from the proceedings of his fitness to practice here. They found numerous mitigating circumstances. He was young, inexperienced, he had no training for this, no supervision, no handover, no policies. He'd only been there a few days. And he was working in an environment where his dual loyalty was very, very sorely tested. They recognised he was an excellent doctor. He'd gone on to practice as a GP, civilian GP, and he had enormous support from the community that he'd served. But really that was a failure of the system, I think, in recognising enormous complexity and difficulty in standing up for one's medical ethics in a system that sometimes doesn't understand the overwhelming imperative to act as a doctor rather than as a military officer. There are other examples, the examples around Abu Ghraib, American military doctors recorded at length in the medical literature. This example from Vietnam, a dermatologist, Howard Levy, who refused to train US Special Forces medics who were going to Vietnam, who were going to make the provision of medical care contingent on access to villages in Vietnam. So we talked about that before. Examples of unethical medical treatment. We've talked about prescribing performance-enhancing medication, the penicillin example, and there's, again, a number of examples of where physicians have been called on and have practiced battlefield euthanasia. Some of us have, from time to time, been asked to give opinions on non-lethal weapons research. Is that ethical? If it's an alternative to lethal weapons, is that ethical? There are actually very strict guidelines around this, and the answer is it is unethical. But then there are examples when things go right. Yeah. All right, so very, very quickly, when things go right, this is a terrific example from the Falklands War. Surgeon Commander Jolly treated both Argentinians and British soldiers exactly the same. This is his rationale for doing so, going back to Nelson's thoughts before the Battle of Trafalgar. Numerous other examples from the First World War, the American Vietnam War as well, where doctors were recognised to treat enemy casualties the same as their own. I'll just skip over this and come to the last slide, which is the benefit of doing this. One, of course, is that it enables us to remain doctors. But there's benefit to the combatant force as well. It enables us to maintain the best relationships in the post-conflict state. Eventually all wars end. And the Argentinians and the British, in that example, I am sure, came to a better relationship, a better understanding, at least in part because of this story of their prisoners being treated well by Commander Jolly. It facilitates freedom of action within the country, as in the provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan that I skipped over just briefly there. It justifies prohibiting targeting medical facilities. It keeps us safe if we're treating the enemy as much as we treat our own. And finally, it allows us to maintain the same professional standards as our civilian colleagues. In other words, fundamentally, it allows us to stay doctors and not some sort of quasi-doctor that works in the military to some other set of ethical standards. And I sense I'm being pushed off the stage. I'll be very happy to answer any questions about this afterwards. Thanks for your attention.